The $4 Ranch. At 19, Caleb Whitlock finally understood how his uncle had always valued him, in meals eaten, boots worn out, and coal burned. Every cent spent raising an orphan nephew had been logged in a book as though the boy were nothing more than livestock that never earned its keep. By sundown that day, he was told to leave. He walked off with $11, a handful of belongings, an Osage-orange marking knife, and a rust-colored dog named Rusty trotting at his heel. 3 days on, clerks at the Red Basin Land Office snickered as Caleb handed over $4 for a forsaken claim nobody wanted, a place folks called Deadwell Ranch. The cabin sagged. The ground was crusted white with alkali. Everyone assumed he'd bought himself a grave with a roof over it, mostly because the 43-foot well hadn't produced water in years. But when Caleb climbed down into that black shaft and his tool struck bottom, the sound was wrong for dirt. It rang hollow. Metal against something behind a crooked run of stone. Up above, Rusty growled into the darkness. Whatever weighted down there proved the well had never truly gone dry at all. What was buried in that shaft was worth finding out. The answer was close. But for Caleb, the hard lesson about worth had started long before that well. A house with order. 8 years earlier, Caleb had known a different kind of home. He'd been born at a freight depot east of Red Basin Crossing. His father, Thomas Whitlock, mended saddles and drove wagon teams. His mother, Ellen, kept the books and taught her son to read using crate labels, invoices, and old newspapers. They weren't wealthy, but their household ran on order. Thomas showed him knots, balance, how weight rode differently across a loaded axle. Ellen drilled him on arithmetic with dried beans scattered across the table. Every seat at supper was filled. Then one winter, a passing caravan brought lung sickness into the house. Thomas died first. Ellen followed 6 days later. At 11 years old, Caleb was sent to live with his uncle, Garrett Whitlock, who ran a feed warehouse. Garrett never raised a hand to him, he simply put the boy to work. Sweeping floors. Hauling sacks. Tending horses. Patching barrels. Sleeping in the storeroom. In Garrett's house, every meal and every night's shelter was counted and recorded. Before long, Caleb understood that his own existence had become a line item in someone's ledger. During those years under his uncle's roof, Caleb was often sent to deliver broken barrels and leaking troughs to the workshop of Silas Corbin, an old cooper and well builder who mended water troughs, lined stone wells, and built cisterns for stage stations scattered across the territory. Silas noticed something in the boy right away. He didn't just look at tools, he watched how they were used. Rather than offer sympathy, Silas gave him work, sorting iron hoops, soaking barrel staves, scraping old pitch away, picking flat stones, tapping empty barrels until the sound alone revealed their weak points. Bit by bit, lessons took the place of conversation. Dark soil held moisture longer. A crust of white alkali on the surface didn't mean everything beneath it was dead. A thin patch of moss on a rock's north face often marked a hidden seep. Clear water wasn't always safe water. A stone set wrong threw its weight onto every stone around it. A settling basin always belonged upstream of a storage well. And every waterway needed somewhere to drop its mud before reaching the final reservoir. Silas repeated one line so often that Caleb never forgot it: never measure with hope. Measure with evidence. On Caleb's 17th birthday, Silas pressed an Osage-orange marking knife into his hand, half-inch notches carved along its spine. He never called it a gift. He only said the blade had finally found the right hand to hold it. A year later, Silas Corbin died quietly at the close of an ordinary workday. No accident, no farewell speech, he was simply found slumped against his bench, one hand still gripping a strip of hoop iron he'd never finished bending. After the funeral, Garrett sold off nearly every tool in the shop to settle an old debt. Caleb couldn't afford a single one. All that remained his was the marking knife Silas had given him. Silas had also kept a young rust-colored dog around the workshop to guard the wagons and chase off rats. Nobody wanted him. Garrett called the animal one more useless mouth to feed. Caleb didn't argue. That night, he simply set half his cornbread down by the warehouse door. The dog stayed. From then on, Caleb worked for his uncle by day, quietly repaired things after dark, slept with the dog, now named Rusty, curled at his feet, and carried the marking knife in his coat everywhere he went. Nobody ever called the boy, the dog, and the knife a family. They didn't have to. Cast out. At the end of September 1881, Garrett Whitlock called Caleb into the ledger room behind the warehouse. The meeting was short. "The store's been sold," Garrett said. "Wendell Voss takes over next week. He's bringing his own men." Caleb said nothing. "You're old enough to fend for yourself now." Garrett opened the ledger. "Your parents left almost nothing. Food, clothes, lodging, the doctor's bills, repairs, it's all been tallied." He slid a thin envelope across the table. "Once every account is settled, $11 remain." He never called Caleb worthless outright. His words were colder than that. "My obligation is finished. The books balance. There's nothing left to owe." Caleb looked down at the open ledger. His name sat wedged between sacks of corn, horse feed, roof repairs, and torn harness leather. One more deducted expense, like anything else kept in storage. He never asked how much his parents had truly left behind. He simply took the envelope. In the small room behind the warehouse, he packed everything he owned: a worn wool blanket, a dented tin pot, a firebox, the Osage orange marking knife, a coil of hemp rope, a patch coat, and 2 sacks of coarse cornmeal. It was enough. Outside, Rusty waited by the back steps. Garrett glanced at the dog. "That animal isn't my problem." Caleb rested a hand on Rusty's neck. "It never was." Those were the only words he gave his uncle before walking away. The warehouse door shut behind him with a dull thud. Rusty never looked back. Neither did Caleb. The road west. Caleb and Rusty struck out southwest. The first day tested them hard. A hot wind dragged dust across the prairie like smoke, and the water in Caleb's canteen vanished faster than he'd planned. By afternoon, Rusty's pace had slowed. When they stopped, Caleb poured a small measure of water into the lid of his tin pot. Rusty drank first. Only once the dog had finished did Caleb lift the canteen and swallow what was left. By the second afternoon, they crossed paths with Jed Calloway, a freight hauler carrying hides and tallow toward Red Basin Crossing. One of his rear wagon pins had worked loose. Jed climbed down with a sigh. Caleb studied the wheel without a word, then carved a temporary pin from a scrap of ash wood using his marking knife and a length of hemp cord tight enough to steady the axle. The fix took only minutes and held the load. Jed offered no money, just a place on the wagon bench, right if you're heading west. He threw in a sack of dry cornbread and refilled Caleb's water jug. Caleb accepted. It was payment, not charity. As the wagon rolled on, Jed talked about abandoned claims scattered past the settlement. Drought had emptied most of them. Wells failed after a season or two. Families bought cheap land, endured one winter, and vanished before the next. "There's one place nobody'll touch," Jed finally said. "Deadwell Ranch." Even the name sounded worn out. "Folks say that well died years back. That night coyotes called from the hills." Rusty lifted his head, listened, then settled by the wagon instead of wandering off. $4. Red Basin Crossing amounted to little more than a general store, a land office, a livery, a sawmill, a small church, and a scattering of weather-beaten houses. Rusty curled up under the porch while Caleb went inside the land office. Behind a scarred desk sat Simeon Vance, a gray-haired clerk who'd processed more failed claims than successful ones. "What can I do for you?" "I need land I can afford." Simeon gave a thin smile. "The good land's already spoken for." He eyed Caleb's worn coat. $11 won't even buy a mule." Caleb held his ground. "Anything gone to the county for unpaid taxes?" The question changed the clerk's expression. Without a word, Simeon pulled a dusty file from beneath the desk, tied shut with faded string. "Colton Ridge Claim Cabin, 14 by 17 feet, 143-foot well. 160 acres, mostly dry grassland. Owner Isaiah Colton, missing nearly 7 years, back taxes unpaid, no current resident, well presumed dead." Simeon closed the file. Transfer fees $4. 2 for the record, 1 for the survey copy, 1 for the county seal. He looked straight at Caleb. $4 won't buy water. Caleb reached into his pocket. It buys the right to find out where the water went. 4 silver dollars landed on the desk. Simeon stared at the coins longer than he'd stared at the young man who'd placed them there, as if it were hard to say which of the two deserved more pity. Deadwell Ranch. By late afternoon, Caleb and Rusty reached the Colton Ridge claim. The property sat inside a shallow basin beneath a western slope. The cabin leaned northwest, part of its sod roof had torn away, the front door faced straight into the winter wind. The L-shaped livestock shed had caved in along one side, and old willow fencing lay buried under dry grass. About 40 paces from the cabin stood the stone well, the one Jed had called Dead Well. Caleb didn't judge the place all at once. Silas had taught him to read a property one piece at a time. He started with the cabin. The stone foundation was still level, 3 corner posts stood solid, the gray cottonwood walls were weathered but sound underneath, the south roof beam could be reused, and though the chimney throat was cracked, the firebox hadn't collapsed. Then he studied the land itself. Near the dry creek bed the soil ran darker. Sagebrush grew thicker on the lower ground. Thin moss clung to the north faces of scattered limestone rocks. Farther upslope, a line of dead cottonwoods curved across the ridge in a pattern no wild stand of trees would form on its own. He looked at the well last. Its upper ring had clearly been built with more care than anything else on the property, several stones dressed smooth on the inside, old chisel marks showing a skilled mason's hand. White mineral crust ringed the base, but only in broken patches rather than one even band. Rusty circled slowly around the well's north side, then stopped, nose fixed on a patch of ground that felt noticeably cooler in the afternoon shade. Caleb knelt at the stonework and used the half-inch marks on his knife to measure the spacing between joints. One section didn't match the rest, someone had taken part of the ring apart and rebuilt it after the well was first finished. He pressed a hand to the rim. Most of the stone held the day's warmth, but a narrow seam along the north side stayed cool. Cool enough to make him wonder whether the people of Red Basin Crossing had simply mistaken silence for death. Opening the well. Caleb hauled his gear into the cabin, then walked straight back out. The roof could wait. Water couldn't. What little he had left would barely stretch another day between himself, Rusty, and the work ahead. He searched the ruined shed before touching the well again, turning up a cracked wooden bucket, a length of weathered rope, 2 stray juniper poles, and part of a rotted handwheel. It was enough. He wrapped the bucket in soaked rawhide until the cracks sealed, spliced fresh hemp onto the old line, and lashed the juniper poles into a rough tripod over the shaft. Before lowering anything further, he followed a habit Silas had drilled into him years earlier: never trust a silent well. He lit a strip of wick and lowered it into the shaft. The flame weakened, flickered, but didn't go out. The air below could still be breathed. Only then did he begin clearing the well. Every bucket brought up another piece of the past: rotten leaves, broken branches, fragments of an old well cover, dry mud, rabbit bones, loose stone. The work dragged on for hours, the rope wore his palms raw. Rusty rested in the cabin's shadow, but every time the bucket struck bottom, Caleb walked back to the rim and listened. Late in the afternoon, the sound changed. The bucket no longer landed with a dull thud, it rang against something harder, leaving a hollow echo beneath the stone lining. Caleb leaned over the rim and hooked what felt like a buried rock. He pulled. The well's eastern side shifted. One stone slipped, another cracked loose. Stop. He let go of the strain at once. A single stone tumbled down into the dark, once, twice, 3 times, then silence. Rusty sprang to his feet. Caleb studied the stone ring without touching the rope again. The lesson was plain: the well didn't need more force, it needed bracing before another pound of debris came out. For the first time since arriving at Dead Well, progress meant slowing down. The next morning he refused to pull another bucket until the well was secure. He braced the weakened wall with 2 straight juniper poles, a heavy crosspiece, dry wooden wedges, and a tightening loop of rope. Only once the loose section stopped shifting did he begin lifting stones out one at a time, each returned to the ground in order, searching for the locking stone that carried the ring's pressure as he worked. The hidden chamber. Rusty circled the north side again, this time scratching lightly at the earth and glancing back. Caleb followed the cue. One stone, chest-high, caught his eye. Its shading didn't match the others, and the joints around it broke from the original pattern. Fine scrape marks suggested it had been pulled and reset more than once. He worked the spine of his marking knife into the seam and twisted gently. The stone slid free, slowly, silently. Behind it lay a small, dry chamber, far drier than the well shaft itself. Caleb reached in and found a linen bundle sealed with beeswax, a leather pouch of mixed coins, a small piece of raw silver, an iron key, a child's wooden horse missing all but one wheel, and finally, a thick packet of folded papers. He opened the coin pouch first, $18, no more, and set it aside without recounting. Then he unfolded the papers, and his hands went still. Drawn in charcoal and oak gall ink was a cross-section of the entire ridge. A buried settling basin beneath a stone outcrop, a horizontal collection trench, a cedar control gate, a mud overflow channel, and one final line running down to the well. The well itself wasn't marked as the source, it was labeled the receiving basin. Along the edge, one careful sentence had been written: if the well is dry, do not dig deeper. Find where the water stopped. Caleb read it twice. For years, the people of Red Basin Crossing had believed the well itself had failed. They'd been wrong. The well was never the beginning, it had always been the end point of a much larger system. Rusty rested his head against Caleb's knee. The $18 sat forgotten beside him, the drawings were worth far more. For $4, Caleb hadn't bought a dead ranch. He'd bought the chance to finish a piece of engineering nobody else had ever understood. Isaiah's letter. That evening, Caleb spread the drawings across the cabin table, weighting each corner with a stone against the wind. Rusty settled beneath the table, ears turned toward the door. Inside the waxed bundle was one last sheet, a letter. It was addressed to whoever proved patient enough to find the hidden chamber. Isaiah Colton had written that he and his wife, Rebecca, settled the land long before anyone called it Deadwell. They'd found a slow seep coming out of the rock beneath the ridge. Isaiah cut a collection trench into the hillside. Rebecca tested every patch of ground for how long it held moisture and planted only where the soil gave a real answer instead of a guess. Together they built the first settling basin, the buried stone channel, the cedar gate, the overflow drain, and finally the receiving well. Their young son, Micah, spent his days dragging a small wooden horse across the yard while they worked. Then came the winter that took both Rebecca and Micah to lung sickness. Isaiah kept the system running alone for a while, but after a mudslide clogged the collection trench, one man couldn't clear the hillside by himself. His letter asked for nothing but this: if you can make the water run again, let this house hear footsteps once more. Caleb folded the letter carefully and laid it beside his marking knife and Micah's broken wooden horse. Before putting out the lantern, his eyes drifted to the cabin doorway, where faint hike marks had been cut into the frame years before. The lowest were nearly worn away, the highest still showed clearly, with one small letter beside it, M. The next morning, Caleb went looking for two forgotten graves. Following Isaiah's directions, he found them beneath a cottonwood split long ago by lightning. The marker stones had tilted, the names nearly weathered away: Rebecca Colton, Micah Colton. He didn't build new monuments, he cleared the dry weeds, reset the stones, and used his marking knife to deepen the letters that could still be read. For a moment he rested the wooden horse on the small grave, then carried it back to the cabin before rain could ruin what was left of it. A new kind of ledger. That afternoon, Caleb opened his notebook and wrote out a plan: find the settling basin, locate the collection trench, clear the blockage without collapsing the hillside, let the water settle before testing it, finish repairing the cabin, and spend the $18 only on supplies he couldn't make himself. He listed every remaining length of rope, every day's food, every bucket of water, every stone and timber he could reuse, every detail from Isaiah's drawings. It became a different kind of ledger, not one that measured what a person had cost, but one that measured what it would take to keep people alive through winter. Before closing the notebook, Caleb wrote two names across the top of the first page: Rebecca, Micah. Then the numbers began. Supplies. Caleb rode back to Red Basin Crossing with a short list. fresh hemp rope, hand-forged nails, a used mattock head, salt, cornmeal, oiled leather for the cabin window, and a damaged sack of lime that still held usable powder at its center. News traveled faster than freight wagons. By the time he reached the lumberyard, people were already calling him the owner of the $4 grave. Thaddeus Kane, the settlement's master carpenter, looked up from his bench. "So you're the one trying to bring Deadwell back to life?" Caleb nodded. Thaddeus studied him a moment. "What wood belongs underground, where it stays damp?" "Cedar." "Why not green cottonwood for permanent wedges?" "It shrinks." "How much room do you leave at the end of a plank before driving a nail?" "Enough that it won't split." "Better yet, bore a pilot hole." "Old roof facing the wind, nails or battens?" "Battens." "What keeps clay mortar from cracking?" "Ash and fiber." Thaddeus said nothing for a long moment. Then he gathered a bundle of cedar offcuts and slid it across the counter. "I'll sell you these at the regular price." He paused. "Pick through the short pieces if you want." Caleb counted out the money without asking for a discount. Thaddeus watched him do it. "You're not completely blind," he said at last, then tapped the bundle. "Ruin these and don't blame the ranch." Caleb hefted the wood onto his shoulder. "I won't." Whatever came next, nature alone would decide who was right. Finding the basin. According to Isaiah's drawing, the settling basin lay nearly 200 paces north of the well, hidden beneath a low ridge of stone. Caleb followed the map, Rusty followed the ground. Before long they found the first signs: a shallow dip crossing the hillside, flat stones under a layer of grass, sagebrush growing thicker than anywhere nearby. A hand's depth into the soil, the earth turned cool. Rusty stopped at a narrow crack between two rocks and scratched, and the smell of damp earth lingered there. Caleb pulled the stones away one at a time and found the collapsed roof of the settling basin beneath. Inside, years had packed in red clay, tree roots, rotted leaves, fine sand, and the broken remains of a cedar control gate. He didn't clear it all at once. First he dug a temporary overflow trench so loosened mud would spill away from the receiving well instead of into it. Only then did he keep working. Late on the second day, something changed. A thin ribbon of water slipped through the trench and moved quietly across the stones. The seep was alive. But the water ran red with earth, thick with sediment. Caleb didn't drink it, and he didn't let Rusty drink either. Instead he guided the flow into a shallow testing pit and left it untouched overnight. By sunrise, the surface water had cleared, though nearly 2 inches of settled mud sat at the bottom. The seep had survived. The system hadn't. Caleb folded the drawing and looked back at the hillside. Finding water had only been half the job. Unless the basin and overflow channel were rebuilt, the well would slowly bury itself again. Rusty lowered his head toward the fresh water one more time. Caleb gently pulled the bowl away. Their clean supply was nearly gone, and he wasn't willing to gamble with what remained. The widow's trade. While Caleb worked at the basin, a wagon pulled up outside the ranch. Beatrice Lowry, a widowed homesteader from a neighboring claim, climbed down with her 2 children, Nora and Wyatt, 10 and 7. She hadn't come to congratulate him. One of her wooden watering troughs had cracked, and her goats were losing water every day. Thaddeus Kane had mentioned that the young man at Deadwell knew how to mend barrels and troughs. She offered a trade. Cornmeal, sour goat's milk, a roll of goat hair, and an aging doe that still gave enough milk to earn her keep. In exchange, Caleb would fix the trough and rebuild part of her fence. He agreed, no haggling, no favors, just work traded for work. At Beatrice's homestead, Caleb repaired the trough with willow boards, rawhide lashings, pine pitch, and a thin cedar brace. Nora watched every move. "Why don't you seal every crack?" she asked. "Because drywood swells," Caleb answered. "Force it too tight now, and it'll split once it drinks." She nodded and asked nothing more. As Caleb packed his tools, Wyatt noticed the small wooden horse tucked inside his coat. "Did it ever roll?" he asked quietly. "It did once." The boy smiled and never asked to keep it. Small mistakes, steady fixes. Back at Deadwell, Caleb mixed goat hair into clay and wood ash before pressing the chinking into the cabin walls, the fibers binding the mixture just as Silas had once taught him. That night, new sounds filled the ranch, the dough shifting in the mended shed, Rusty padding slow circles around the cabin, water dripping steadily into the settling pit. The cabin was still cold, but for the first time in years it no longer sounded empty. The ranch improved day by day, and every repair carried its own lesson. The first mistake showed up in the cabin walls. His initial batch of chinking held too much clay, and after 2 nights of frost, thin cracks spread through the seams. He scraped it away and mixed a new batch with less clay, more wood ash, shredded yucca fiber, and goat hair from Beatrice's trade, pressing it into the gaps in thinner layers. This time the walls held. The second mistake came from the roof. A strong wind lifted 3 newly laid cedar shakes just before sunset. Nails alone weren't enough on weathered rafters. Caleb fastened cedar battens across the roof, tying them into the strongest framing beneath. When the wind returned 2 days later, the shingles stayed put. The third mistake came with rain. A sudden storm filled the settling basin faster than expected, and mud rushed toward the channel. Rusty barked from the hillside as water spilled over the edge. Caleb hurried up, reopened the overflow path, and set large stones across the inlet to slow the current before it reached the basin. The water calmed, and the mud settled where it belonged instead of where it could cause harm. The deputy's visit. Before the ground had fully dried, Deputy Foster Grimes rode into the yard with a leather satchel under one arm, full of questions. "Do you hold a legal claim?" Caleb handed over the county papers. "Have you lived here continuously?" "Since the day I arrived." "Found any silver worth reporting?" Caleb shook his head. $18. "That's all." "Planning to sell the property?" "No." Rather than keep arguing, Caleb set his notebook on the cabin table. Deputy Grimes opened it and found every page in the same careful order: the hour of every water measurement, the number of buckets collected, the depth of settled sediment, the timber used, the repairs that failed, and the corrections that followed. Nothing erased, nothing hidden. He turned slowly back to the first page, where 2 names stood above every column of figures: Rebecca, Micah. He studied them a long moment before closing the book. "You've done enough to prove you're improving the claim," he said quietly. "Whether it holds up or not, nature will decide." Caleb nodded. That had always been the only judge that mattered. The storm. Early December changed everything. The warning didn't start with snow, it started with silence. The afternoon wind died without reason. The northern sky turned the color of lead. The livestock's breath hung low against the frozen ground instead of drifting off. Rusty refused to leave the cabin porch. The old doe stood facing the same direction for nearly an hour. A thin sheet of ice crept across the water trough long before sunset. Word reached the ranch through Simeon Vance. The northern mail station had reported a fast-moving cold front pushing south. Later that day, Thaddeus Kane rode past and studied the roof from horseback. "If the wind swings," he warned, "that old roof will find every weak spot." Caleb answered by checking every system one last time: the roof battens, the door wedges, the fresh chinking, the chimney throat, the shed doors, the settling basin, the overflow channel, the well cover. He buried the shallowest stretch of the water channel under another layer of earth, covered the settling basin with dry grass for insulation, and carried the smallest trough into the shed before dark. Then he measured everything. Outside temperature, water level in the well, firewood remaining, buckets of clean water stored in the cabin. Rusty stayed at his side the whole time. Night fell, still no snow. Then the wind swung northwest, and the first hard gust struck the door like a falling log. Nature never announced its judgment, it simply rewrote every condition the ranch would have to survive. The blizzard hit after midnight, fast and merciless. Wind screamed across the basin, driving snow and alkali dust into one gray wall. The roof shuddered, the cedar shakes strained against the rafters, the battens groaned and held. The cabin walls answered next. The new chinking crackled under the sudden freeze, sharp little sounds, but the seams stayed shut. Cold still crept across the floorboards, but the walls stopped the wind where it mattered most. Then the chimney failed. The shifting wind pushed smoke back into the cabin. Caleb moved fast, narrowing the air opening beneath the fire, feeding the stove hotter, wedging a temporary stone baffle into the firebox to steady the draft. Slowly the smoke cleared and the chimney drew again. Outside, every shallow trough froze solid. Inside the well, the water kept moving, the buried seep never touched the freezing air, and the insulated settling basin protected the flow. It slowed. It never stopped. Shelter from the storm. Then Rusty exploded into barking. Not at the storm, at the door. A weak pounding followed. Caleb hauled it open against the wind and found Beatrice standing outside with Nora and Wyatt pressed against her, snow thick on their coats. Their barn roof had collapsed. Their hand pump had frozen. Their wagon horse had gone lame trying to pull free. No words were needed. Caleb stepped aside. They came in. The door shut. The dough stayed safe in the shed. The stored water was measured out carefully. Each person received exactly what the notebook allowed, no more, no less. The night settled into a rhythm of necessary work, drying gloves, tightening blankets, feeding the fire, clearing snow from the door, checking the chimney, listening to the roof, waiting out the next gust. The hours passed. The cabin held. Near the stove, Wyatt finally fell asleep, one hand still curled around Micah's little wooden horse. Caleb noticed and left it exactly where it was. Until morning, it belonged there. After the storm. By the second morning, the wind had begun to weaken, and the basin slowly emerged from the drifted snow. Across the surrounding claims, the storm had left its verdict: fence lines buried under drifts, 2 livestock sheds collapsed under the weight of snow, several shallow wells frozen solid, and at one homestead, muddy runoff poured straight into the water supply. Deadwell Ranch still stood. Before noon, Thaddeus Kane rode in beside Deputy Grimes. Neither man had come to offer congratulations, they'd come to inspect. Thaddeus climbed onto the roof first, checking every cedar batten, every nail head, every exposed rafter. He ran a hand across the chinking and studied the chimney throat without a word. Nothing had shifted. Nothing important had failed. Meanwhile, Grimes walked to the well. This time he didn't ask for the claim papers, he inspected every sign of survival on the land. The marks of weathering the storm, the carefully updated water ledger, the restored seep channel, the settling basin. Then he asked Caleb to draw water. The first bucket carried a bit of fine sediment, expected after a storm. The second came up clear. Grimes watched Caleb lower the line again, the water level dipped only slightly before beginning to recover. Caleb opened his notebook. Before the repairs, the well had nearly run dry. After the seep was reopened, the standing water held at roughly 31 inches. The well now supplied 7 to 9 full buckets before showing any real drop. During the blizzard, the cabin had stayed about 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, and once the new chinking was finished, the woodpile lasted noticeably longer each freezing night. No claim rested on opinion. Every page held measurements, every mistake was recorded right beside the correction that followed it. Thaddeus closed the notebook and looked back toward the roof, where the battens still held. He stood quietly a moment, then nodded once. I was wrong about this ranch. No one answered. No one needed to. Inside the cabin, Beatrice, Nora, and Wyatt were alive. Outside, clear water filled the trough, and the roof still covered the walls. Those were the only arguments that mattered. Grimes pulled a pencil from his coat and added one final note to the county record. The claimant had established continuous residence, the land had been actively improved, and the claim remained valid. 1 year later. Later that afternoon, Simeon Vance arrived from town and stopped beside the trough to watch fresh water spill into it. For a long time he said nothing, and he never repeated what he'd once said in the land office. For dollars hadn't bought water, it had bought the chance to understand where the water had been waiting all along. A year later, the Colton Ridge claim hadn't become a wealthy ranch. It had become a working one. The cabin held its warmth through every cold night. A small livestock shed stood where broken boards had once leaned. A handful of goats grazed the hillside. A drought-tolerant garden grew beside the restored water line. Rebuilt fences kept the animals where they belonged. The settling basin rested safely under its blanket of earth. The well ran with a steady flow of clean water. Neighbors began stopping by to study the underground seep system. Caleb never called it his own invention. Whenever anyone asked, he unfolded Isaiah's drawing and pointed to the title written across the top, Colton Seep Line. Thaddeus Kane adapted the settling basin design for another ranch farther west. Beatrice rebuilt her livestock trough with a proper overflow channel. Deputy Grimes kept a copy of the drawings filed with the county records. Nora learned to mark the daily water levels in a ledger of her own. Wyatt sometimes rolled Micah's little wooden horse across the cabin porch, always setting it back on the railing before he left. Garrett Whitlock never came to apologize. A freight driver passing through mentioned hearing stories about the boy who'd turned a $4 ranch into a working homestead. Caleb asked no questions and sent no letters. He didn't need an argument to feel vindicated. Late one afternoon, he stood beside the cedar water trough, Silas's marking knife resting comfortably in his hand. Micah's wooden horse waited on the porch railing. Rusty slept at his feet. Fresh water ran steadily through the cedar channel. Silas had given him the knowledge to build. Isaiah had given him the place where that knowledge could go on. Nature had decided whether the work deserved to survive, offering no praise, no explanation, just water that kept flowing. Rusty lifted his head as Wyatt ran laughing across the yard. The little wooden horse rolled once along the railing before settling beside the marking knife. Below them, clear water kept filling the trough. Some ledgers measure what people take. This one measured what they protected. On the quiet frontier, that was enough.